The words landed like a bullet she had not seen coming. Wilhelmina Thatcher stood in the middle of the Dry Creek Marshal's office with the afternoon light cutting through the single dusty window and painting gold bars across the worn plank floor, and she could not breathe. She had ridden 3 hours through blistering July heat to confront Isaac Turner about the territorial investigation, about the names in the federal ledger, about the sworn testimonies that had somehow, impossibly, never once included her own. She had come ready for anger. She had come prepared for cold, official indifference. She had not come prepared for this. Isaac stood behind the wide oak desk, his hat already in his hands, turning the brim between his fingers the way she had noticed he did when something cost him something real. His jaw was set. His gray eyes were steady. And when he spoke, his voice was the quietest thing in the room, quieter than the tick of the iron clock on the wall, quieter than the hot wind pressing at the window glass. "Every report I filed kept your name out of it on purpose," he said. The silence after that sentence was enormous. Wilhelmina felt the floor tilt under her boots. She had spent 4 months believing the omission was an accident, a bureaucratic mercy she did not deserve but had been quietly grateful for. She had rebuilt her life on that thin, anonymous ground. She had opened her seamstress shop again. She had started sleeping through the night again. She had stopped flinching every time a rider came down the main road toward town, and it had not been an accident at all. It had been him. Deliberately, repeatedly, filing official territorial reports to the Denver office that could have destroyed her and choosing, every single time, to leave her name off the page. "Why?" she said, and it was not quite a question because part of her already knew, and that part terrified her more than anything else in this story of hidden motives and forced choices and dark pasts that neither of them had ever fully spoken aloud. Isaac set his hat on the desk. He did not look away from her. "Because the truth of what you did and the crime they wanted to charge you with are not the same thing," he said. "And I was not going to let them make it the same thing." Wilhelmina's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt. She had to understand how they had arrived here. She had to go back to the beginning. It had started 11 months ago, in the autumn of 1878, in the high desert town of Dry Creek, New Mexico Territory, when the body of a man named Gerald Thatcher was found at the bottom of Cutter's Ravine with 2 broken ribs and a broken neck, and when the widow who bore his name stood in her doorway, watching the deputy's horse come up the road with the measured stillness of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of news for a very long time. Dry Creek was the kind of town that the railroad had bypassed and then forgotten. It sat on a flat shelf of red earth between 2 low ridgelines, populated by about 400 souls who had all come there for one reason or another, and then discovered that leaving was harder than arriving. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Painted Rail, a church that doubled as a school, 3 dozen houses in various states of repair, and a marshal's office that had been vacant for 2 years before Isaac Turner rode in from Albuquerque on a bay horse with a federal appointment letter in his saddlebag and very little inclination to explain himself to anyone. Isaac Turner was 31 years old at that point in the autumn of 1878. He was broad through the shoulder and lean through the hip, with dark hair that needed cutting and a marshal's star that he wore on his coat but rarely polished. He had been a deputy in 2 other territories before taking the Dry Creek appointment, and the people who had worked with him in those territories used the same word to describe him with remarkable consistency. They said he was quiet, not slow, not dull, not shy. Quiet in the way of still water, quiet in the way of a man who listened so carefully to everything around him that he had very little left to add aloud. He had been in Dry Creek for 6 weeks when Gerald Thatcher went over the edge of Cutter's Ravine. Wilhelmina Thatcher was 28 years old and she had been married to Gerald Thatcher for 7 years. And in those 7 years, she had learned things about herself that she wished she had never needed to learn. She had learned that she was stronger than she appeared. She had learned that fear could become so familiar it stopped registering as fear and began to feel simply like the air of a room. She had learned that there was a particular kind of loneliness specific to being isolated inside a marriage, surrounded by people who saw her every Sunday at church and still saw nothing. Gerald Thatcher was not a man who left visible marks. That was the thing that made everything so complicated. He was generous in public, funny at the painted rail, a reliable hand to any neighbor who needed help with fencing or harvest. Whatever he was in the private hours of their house on the east end of Palo Verde Street, he was something else entirely under the open sky of Dry Creek, and the town loved him for the version they saw, and Wilhelmina had long since stopped trying to explain the difference. She had one friend who knew. Her name was Addie Crane, who ran the post office window inside the general store and who had once, on a cold February morning, looked at Wilhelmina's wrist and said nothing at all, just reached across the counter and covered it with her own hand for a moment before a customer came in. That silence between them had been the most honest conversation Wilhelmina had ever had with anyone in Dry Creek. On the night Gerald Thatcher died, Wilhelmina was home alone. She had been home alone because Gerald had gone to the painted rail after supper as he did several evenings a week, and when he was at the painted rail she had learned to breathe differently, slower and fuller, the way lungs behave when the weight on the chest is briefly lifted. She had sewn by candlelight and then banked the fire and gone to sleep before midnight. What she did not know until much later was that Gerald had left the painted rail at 9:30 in the company of a man named Dale Cutter, who was the second son of the family that owned the ravine that bore their name, and that the two of them had ridden out to the ravine together over some dispute about a cattle grazing contract that had been simmering for months, and that whatever had happened at the edge of that ravine, only Dale Cutter had ridden back from it. Wilhelmina did not know any of that on the morning the deputy came to her door. She knew only that her husband was dead, and that the expression on Deputy Hale's young face carried something she could not quite read, something suspended between official solemnity and private speculation. Isaac Turner came to her door himself the following afternoon. She opened it to find him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, and she had the immediate impression of a man who was being very careful about something without being able to tell her what it was. He introduced himself properly. He said he was sorry for her loss. He asked if he could come inside and ask her a few questions, and she said yes, and she made coffee because it was the thing you did, the ritual of ordinary life pressed up against extraordinary circumstances. He sat at her kitchen table, and he asked her where she had been on the night of the 14th, and she told him, and he wrote it down. He asked if Gerald had said anything to her before he left for the painted rail, and she said no more than usual. He asked if she knew Dale Cutter, and she said she knew of him. They were acquainted as everyone in a town of 400 is acquainted. He asked his questions, and he listened to her answers with that careful quality she was already beginning to notice, that sense of a man not just cataloging information but weighing it, turning it over, checking its surfaces for something more. At the end he closed his notebook, and he looked at her across the table and he said, "Mrs. Thatcher, is there anything you want to tell me that I haven't asked about?" It was such an unusual question. Most officials she had encountered in her life were not interested in what you volunteered unprompted. They were interested in the form of the thing, the procedure, the documented answer to the documented question. She looked back at him across the table and she thought about all the things she could say. She thought about 7 years of things she could say. She said, "No, Marshal, I think you have everything you need." He held her gaze for one moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he put on his hat and thanked her and left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone, listening to the sound of his horse moving away down Palo Verde Street, and she felt something she could not immediately name. It was not relief exactly. It was not comfort. It was something more like the sensation of being seen by someone who was being very intentional about what they chose to do with what they saw. The investigation into Gerald Thatcher's death proceeded over the following weeks with the methodical quietness that seemed to characterize everything Isaac Turner did. He interviewed witnesses at the Painted Rail. He rode out to Cutter's Ravine and spent most of a day there examining the terrain and the tracks. He spoke to Dale Cutter twice, and after the second conversation, Dale Cutter left town for a week and returned looking considerably less comfortable in his own skin. What the town did not know, and what Wilhelmina did not know, was that Isaac Turner had found something at Cutter's Ravine that complicated the narrative considerably. He had found, among other things, evidence that Gerald Thatcher had been there before his death, and not recently. The ground near the south edge of the ravine, in a place sheltered by an overhang of rock, showed the marks of repeated visits, the remains of small fires, the crushed earth of someone who had used that spot as a regular stopping place. And near those marks, wrapped in oilcloth and wedged into a crack in the rock face, he had found a ledger. The ledger belonged to Gerald Thatcher. It was written in his hand. And it documented, in careful columns and dated entries, a system of quiet extortion that Gerald Thatcher had been running against 3 separate businesses in Dry Creek for the better part of 4 years, including Addie Crane's General Store, the Painted Rail, and most devastatingly, the tiny seamstress shop that bore Wilhelmina's maiden name, Blackwood Stitchery, which she had opened in the 2nd year of their marriage with money she had saved entirely on her own, and which she had been paying her own husband a monthly sum to leave alone. Isaac Turner sat in his office the night he found the ledger and read it twice, and then he sat for a long time with it open on the desk in front of him and thought about the woman at the kitchen table who had said there was nothing more she wanted to tell him. He thought about the way she had said it, not evasive, not guilty, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. The voice of a woman who had decided, at some point long before that conversation, that certain truths were not safe to release into the world, and who had made her peace with carrying them alone. He thought about what the ledger proved about Gerald Thatcher, and what it implied about Wilhelmina Thatcher, and what the territorial prosecutor in Albuquerque would do with both of those things if he sent this ledger along with his report. He thought about the law, which he had spent most of his adult life serving, and about the justice that the law was supposed to produce, and about the distance between those two things that sometimes opened up like a canyon you did not see until you were already at the edge. He closed the ledger. He put it back in the oilcloth. He took it home and locked it in the strongbox under his bed. He did not mention the ledger in his first report to the territorial office. He told himself he needed more time to understand the full picture before committing anything to official record. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had ridden past the Blackwood Stitchery 3 times in the past 2 weeks on legitimate patrol routes that did not technically require him to go down that particular street, and he had looked at the light in the window each time, the warm yellow square of it against the autumn dark, and he had thought about Wilhelmina Thatcher sewing by candlelight while her husband was at the Painted Rail, and something in his chest had done a thing he was not entirely prepared to examine. He was a federal marshal. He was conducting an official investigation. He was a disciplined, careful man who believed in procedure and in doing the work correctly. None of that changed what was happening in the vicinity of his chest. He put it aside. He went back to work. What he did do in the days after finding the ledger was quietly begin a separate, off-the-record investigation into Dale Cutter. Not into Gerald Thatcher's death specifically, but into Dale Cutter's business dealings, his movements, his connections. Because the ledger had revealed something else that Isaac had not expected, which was that Gerald Thatcher had not been operating his extortion scheme alone. There was a name that appeared in the later entries, a partner referred to only by initials, DC, who had been providing Gerald with information about the businesses, inside information, the kind that only someone with regular access to the Painted Rail's books and the General Store's accounts could have had. Dale Cutter had worked odd jobs at both establishments. The story of Gerald Thatcher's death, Isaac was beginning to understand, was not a simple story about a grazing contract dispute. It was a story about a partnership gone wrong, about two men who had been running a quiet criminal enterprise together and had reached some kind of breaking point, and about what happened when one of them decided the other was too much of a liability to keep alive. This changed things. It did not change everything, but it changed enough. Isaac Turner went back to speak to Dale Cutter a third time, and this time he went with more than questions. He went with the kind of precise, specific knowledge that made Dale Cutter's face go from uncomfortable to pale in the span of about 40 seconds. By the end of that conversation, Dale Cutter had confessed to being present at the ravine when Gerald Thatcher fell, and had provided a version of events in which Gerald's death was not entirely premeditated, but rather the result of a physical altercation that had gone further than either man intended. It was not a complete or uncompromised truth. Isaac knew that. But it was enough to close the official case around Gerald Thatcher's death with Dale Cutter named as the responsible party, and it was enough to bring a set of charges to the territorial prosecutor that had nothing to do with Wilhelmina. The first report Isaac filed to the Denver Territorial Office was clean and complete in all the ways that mattered for the official record. It named Dale Cutter. It outlined the circumstances at the ravine. It provided the testimony gathered from witnesses at the painted rail and the physical evidence from the scene. It said nothing about the ledger. It said nothing about extortion. It said nothing about Wilhelmina Thatcher except that she was the widow of the deceased, whose account of her whereabouts on the night in question had been confirmed, and who was not a subject of the investigation. Wilhelmina Thatcher's name appeared exactly once in that first report, in that single sentence, and then not again. Isaac filed it, and then he went to the painted rail and had a glass of rye whiskey, and sat with the particular feeling of a man who has made a choice he cannot unmake and is trying to determine whether it was the right one. 2 weeks after that, the Denver office sent a follow-up inquiry. They had received some information, they said, through a separate channel, suggesting that the deceased had been involved in some form of financial impropriety in Dry Creek. They asked for any supplementary information the local marshal might have on this matter. Isaac sat with that letter for 3 days. The separate channel was almost certainly Dale Cutter, hedging his position, trying to spread the liability, the way guilty men always do when they see the walls beginning to close. It was predictable and it was maddening. He wrote back to Denver. He said that he had investigated the claim of financial impropriety and found insufficient evidence to substantiate it. He said the deceased's business records had been reviewed and showed no irregularities relevant to the current case. He said the matter was closed pending the formal charging of Dale Cutter. This was, in the strict technical sense, a misrepresentation of the facts to a federal authority. Isaac Turner knew that when he wrote it. He wrote it anyway, and he sat afterward with the knowledge of what he had done and what it would mean if anyone ever found out and what it said about him that he was willing to do it. He told himself it was justice, that the law Wilhelmina would have faced, the law that would have looked at a woman paying her own husband to leave her business alone and called it conspiracy or aiding and abetting or any number of other things, was not the same thing as justice. That the truth of her situation, the full, contextualized truth, was that she had been a victim twice over, first of Gerald Thatcher's cruelty and then of his criminality, and that the federal process was not equipped to see that nuance, would not see that nuance, would process her name through its machinery and produce a charge and a trial and a verdict that had nothing to do with who she actually was. He told himself all of that, and it was true. It was all genuinely true. And underneath all of it, beneath the justice and the principle and the careful reasoning, was the fact that when he rode past Blackwood Stitchery in the evenings and saw the warm square of light in the window, something in him that he had not felt move in years moved steadily and surely in her direction, like a compass finding north. He did not act on it. He was not that kind of man, the kind who confuses professional involvement with personal right, who mistakes proximity for permission. He kept his distance, he did his work, he filed his reports. He filed 3 more reports over the following months as the Dale Cutter case worked its way through the territorial system, and in each of those reports, Wilhelmina Thatcher's name did not appear. Not once. He kept her name out of it on purpose, every single time, and he told himself that was where it ended, that was where his involvement in her life concluded, with this professional act of deliberate protection that she would never know about and he would never speak of. He had not counted on the fact that Dry Creek was a town of 400 people, and that 400 people have a way of ensuring that no secret stays fully contained forever. The crack in his intention came from an unexpected direction. It came from Addie Crane. Addie Crane had known Wilhelmina Thatcher for 5 years, and she was a woman of penetrating intelligence and zero tolerance for pretense. She had watched the Cutter case move through the machinery of territorial justice, and she had noticed, with the sharp attention of someone who had been paying very close attention to all of it, that Wilhelmina's name had stayed out of every official document. She had also noticed, because she noticed most things, that the marshal who was handling the case had taken to riding down Palo Verde Street with a frequency that could not be fully explained by patrol necessity. She came into the marshal's office one Thursday morning in December of 1878, 4 months into the investigation, and she closed the door behind her and sat down across from Isaac Turner's desk with the composed directness of a woman who has decided to say a difficult thing and is going to say it. She said, "Marshal Turner, I want to talk to you about Wilhelmina Thatcher." Isaac set down the document he was reading and gave her his full attention. Addie Crane said, "I know you've kept her name out of things. I know what Gerald was doing. I know about the payments from the store. I was the one making them." She held his gaze without flinching. "I also know that what you've done is not nothing. That it came with risk to you, and I want to know what you expect in return." Isaac Turner said, "Nothing." Addie looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman, and she had learned through hard experience to be skeptical of simple answers, especially from men. "Nothing," she repeated. "Nothing," he confirmed. "What I did because it was the right thing to do. I don't expect anything from her. I don't expect anything from you. And I would appreciate it if you didn't tell her, because I'm not doing it so she'll feel obligated to me." Addie Crane was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "You're a very unusual man, Marshal Turner." He picked up his document again. He said, "I'm just trying to do my job correctly." Addie Crane stood up and straightened her coat and walked to the door and then stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "She's been through things that would break most people. She's not broken. She's just being very careful about who she lets near the pieces." She paused. "I think you know that already. I think that's part of why you did what you did. And I think that if you ever get around to being honest with yourself about that, it might be worth being honest with her too." She left before he could answer. He sat with that for a long time. The winter in Dry Creek was cold and dry, the kind of cold that does not come with much snow but sits in the air with a hard, mineral clarity that makes distances look smaller than they are. Wilhelmina opened Blackwood Stitchery 5 days a week and built her business back from the shape it had been reduced to under Gerald's shadow. And she found that without the monthly payments being drained from her small profit, the numbers began to work. She hired a girl named Clara to help with alterations on busy weeks. She ordered new fabric samples from the catalog. She sewed curtains for the new family that had moved into the house at the end of Palo Verde and refused to take any payment for them because the family had 3 children and very little money, and because she could afford to be generous for the first time in years. She was 30 feet from the marshal's office. She passed it every day on her way to and from the stitchery. And she noticed, with the careful peripheral awareness of a woman who had learned to monitor her environment, that Marshal Isaac Turner was frequently there, moving in and out with documents or witnesses, and that he acknowledged her when their paths crossed with a nod that was respectful and never presumptuous. and that he never once looked at her with the particular calculating expression she had learned to read in men who thought her widowhood made her convenient. He looked at her the same way every time. Steady, present, like she was a person he was choosing to see accurately. She told Addie about the nod once in the careful oblique way that she discussed anything personal. Addie made a noise that was not quite a laugh and said, "He's a decent man, Mina." And Wilhelmina said, "Most men seem decent from a distance." And Addie said, "True. But this one seems decent from closer up too, and that's rarer." January brought a cold snap and a broken water pipe at the stitchery, and a situation in which Wilhelmina spent a very unpleasant morning bailing water out of the back room before she got the pipe cold enough to stop the bleeding. She was standing in the street outside her shop in the gray 8 o'clock morning with wet boots and a bucket, and a general air of embattled competence when she heard a voice beside her say, "Do you want help with that?" She turned, and Isaac Turner was standing there in his coat, on his way to the office from wherever he had his breakfast, and he was not asking with the pitying efficiency of a man who thinks a woman can't manage. He was asking like someone who has walked past a problem and noticed that another pair of hands would make it faster. She looked at him. She said, "Do you know anything about pipes?" He said, "A little. I had a house in Albuquerque that hated me." She almost smiled. She said, "All right then." He followed her inside, and he looked at the pipe, and he made 2 trips to the hardware store down the road, and he fixed the pipe in a way that she could tell was temporary but would hold until she could get a proper plumber to look at it. And while he worked, she made coffee on the small iron stove in the back room and handed him a cup when he was done. And they stood in the still damp back room of Blackwood Stitchery and drank coffee together in the January cold and talked about nothing consequential at all. He asked how long she had been sewing. She said since she was 7, her mother had taught her. He said his mother had tried to teach him and given up in the 3rd week. She asked what she had given up on specifically. He said buttonholes. "I cannot do a buttonhole to save my life," he said, with such rueful seriousness that this time she did smile fully without catching herself. He looked at her when she smiled. He looked at her in a way that was careful and full of something she could not quite name, something that sat between admiration and restraint, like a man who is aware of exactly how much he wants something and has made a considered decision about the pace at which he is going to want it. She was aware of that decision. She was aware of it in the way you are aware of something that is being done for your benefit, a door being held open at a distance, a space being kept that says you are safe to approach or not approach at your own speed. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her in a long time. She did not tell him that. She thanked him for the pipe, and he put on his hat and walked back to the marshal's office, and she stood in her back room and thought that Addie Crane might be right, and that being right about a decent man was something that deserved careful consideration, not immediate action, and that careful consideration was exactly what she intended to give it. February came, and with it, the news that the territorial court in Albuquerque had formally charged Dale Cutter with involuntary manslaughter in the death of Gerald Thatcher, and had scheduled a trial for the spring. This information arrived at Isaac Turner's office in an official document, and also at Wilhelmina's ears through the reliable mechanism of Dry Creek's information network, which ran primarily through Addie Crane's post office window and was more efficient than the telegraph. Wilhelmina received this news with a complicated mixture of feelings that she took several days to sort through. There was relief, because Dale Cutter being held responsible meant the official story had closed around someone who bore actual responsibility. There was the strange, particular grief that surfaces when a thing you have been braced for a long time finally arrives, the grief of the ending being real rather than theoretical. And there was something she was reluctant to call gratitude, but that was gratitude nonetheless, directed at the quiet marshal in the office 30 feet down the road who had, for reasons she did not yet understand, kept the story clean. She went to see Addie. She sat at the back of the post office in the small room where Addie kept her accounts and a kettle, and she said, Did he do it because he felt sorry for me? Addie put her teacup down. No, she said. Did he do it because there wasn't enough evidence? Mina. Addie looked at her directly. He did it because he understood the situation and he chose not to make your life harder than it already was. That is not pity and it is not expedience. That is a person deciding that the technical letter of a process matters less than the actual human being in front of them. Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to talk to him. Yes, said Addie, you probably do. She had not known, walking to the marshal's office that July afternoon, that she was walking toward the most important conversation of her life. She had thought she was walking toward clarification, toward understanding the geometry of what had been done and what it meant, and what, if anything, she owed in response. She had been angry in the abstract, furiously so, because being the object of someone's protection, however well-intentioned, without her knowledge or consent, touched a nerve that Gerald Thatcher had spent 7 years sharpening, the nerve that registered any unsanctioned management of her circumstances as a threat. She had arrived at the marshal's office with that anger fully stoked, and had gotten as far as the doorway before the anger had met the reality of Isaac Turner, hat in hands, gray eyes level, saying those words in that quiet voice. Every report I filed kept your name out of it on purpose. And now she was standing in his office in the July heat, with her hands pressed flat against her skirt to keep them from shaking, and she was trying to find the anger she had arrived with and discovering that it had been complicated by something else entirely. You should have told me, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Yes, he said. He did not argue with it or qualify it. He just agreed. You made a decision about my life without asking me. I did. That is not acceptable, she said. I have had enough of people deciding things about my life without asking me. Something shifted in his face. It was not guilt exactly, though that was part of it. It was more like recognition, the recognition of a man who has just understood exactly what he did wrong and why it was wrong and how it connects to something much larger than his intention. You're right, he said. I should have come to you first. I should have told you what I had found and what I intended to do with it and given you the choice. I didn't do that. I told myself it was to protect you and that was true, but it was also because it was easier to make the choice alone than to have the conversation. He paused. That was wrong. Wilhelmina looked at him for a long, measuring moment. The anger was still there. So was the something else. Why, she said again. Not the justice reason, not the legal reasoning. Why did you keep it out? He held her gaze. Because, he said, from the first time I sat across your kitchen table, I understood that you had been carrying something alone for a long time, and I did not want to be the one who added to the weight. The silence stretched out long and warm and full between them. You barely knew me, she said. I know, he said. I didn't need to know you well to understand the shape of the thing. She sat down, not because she was weak but because her legs were making a decision on her behalf and she was tired of fighting decisions that were already made. She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and she looked at the marshal who had been protecting her name in secret for 10 months and she said, Tell me exactly what you found at the ravine. He told her. He told her about the ledger, about the entries, about the initials and the amounts and the dates. He told her about Dale Cutter and the partnership and the grazing contract that had been a pretext for a falling out between criminals. He told her about the letters from Denver and what he had written back. He told her everything, with the same steady, complete honesty he would have brought to a sworn testimony, leaving nothing out. She listened without interrupting. Her face went through several things while he spoke. Confirmation of things she had suspected but never verified. Surprise at the scope of what Gerald had built. A hot, corrosive anger at the years of payments she had made under the impression that she was managing a situation when in fact she had been paying into a scheme she had not known the full shape of. And something underneath the anger that was almost relief, the relief of finally having the full picture, of the hidden thing finally being in the light. When he finished, she said, he was a worse man than even I knew. Yes, Isaac said, and you knew all of it. You knew I had been paying him. Yes. And you still thought I didn't deserve to have my name in those reports. What you did was survival, Isaac said, not conspiracy. Anyone with any decency would see that. The territorial prosecutor might not have, she said. No, he might not have. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you risked a lot, your appointment, your professional record. Yes. Why was it worth that risk to you? He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon sun had moved and was now coming through the window at a lower angle, catching the dust in the air between them and making the light in the room slow and golden. I don't think I can answer that question without telling you something that might make you uncomfortable, he said. She looked at him steadily. Tell me anyway. I told you the justice reasoning, he said, and that is real. All of it is real. But underneath it is something that is not professional. Something I did not act on and would not have acted on. But I would rather be honest with you than leave you thinking this was entirely an abstract principled decision. He met her eyes. I found the ledger and I read it, and then I went home, and I thought about the light in your window when I rode past at night. And I thought about you sitting at your kitchen table telling me there was nothing more to say. And I could not make myself be the person who made your life harder. I could not do it. That is the truth. Wilhelmina Thatcher sat with that truth for several seconds. You rode past my window at night, she said. On patrol, he said. The street runs through my patrol route. 3 times a week, she said. He said nothing. I noticed, she said quietly. The dust moved in the golden afternoon light. I owe you an apology, he said, for not coming to you directly, for making myself part of your story without your knowledge. Whatever my reasons were, you deserve to be informed. You owe me that, yes, she said, and you have given it. She looked at him. What do we do now? It was such a practical question. He almost smiled. He said, I don't know. What do you want to do? She stood up. She crossed to the window and looked out at Palo Verde Street in the July heat, at the dust rising from a wagon going past, at the shape of her own shop 30 feet down the road with its hand-lettered sign. She thought about everything she had built in the past year. She thought about the weight she had carried for 7 years before that. She thought about what it felt like to be seen accurately by another person, without that seeing being used as leverage. I want, she said carefully, to have supper with you on Friday evening, not as a thank you, not as an obligation, because I would like to see what it is like to talk to you when neither of us is managing a crisis. She turned from the window. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face before, not directed at her. It was something composed of warmth and caution and something much deeper than either. Friday, he said. Yes. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, in the same position Addie Crane had stood 4 months ago, and she said without turning around, for what it's worth, Marshal, I'm glad it was you who found the ledger and not someone else. She walked out into the July heat and down Palo Verde Street and back into Blackwood Stitchery, and sat down behind her sewing table, and sat there for a while not sewing anything. Addie came by at 4 o'clock, as Addie generally did on Thursdays, and took one look at Wilhelmina's face and said, Well, Wilhelmina said, we're having supper on Friday. Addie sat down. She said, Tell me everything. Wilhelmina told her most of it, not the part about the window. She kept that part for herself a little longer, turning it over privately the way you turn over something that has value, wanting to understand what you have before you share it with anyone else. Friday came. Isaac Turner arrived at Wilhelmina's door at 6 o'clock in the evening with his hat in his hand, and a clean coat that she noted with some interest appeared to have been recently pressed. And he did not bring flowers because he had thought about bringing flowers, and then thought that flowers were a kind of statement that might outpace where they actually were, and decided that being present and on time and honest was a better beginning. She opened the door in a dress that was dark green and well-made, because she had made it herself and she was good at her work, and she had her dark hair pinned up in a way that was neat rather than elaborate, and she looked like herself, which was what she had decided to be. They walked to the hotel restaurant because it was the best option in Dry Creek, and because it was public, which she appreciated. Not because she needed the protection of witnesses, but because She was not yet ready for the intimacy of a private dinner, and he understood that without her having to explain it. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and they ate roasted chicken and bread, and they talked. Not about the investigation. Not about Gerald or Dale Cutter or the Ledger or Denver. They talked about other things, about his childhood in Ohio, about the territory he had passed through before this appointment, about why he had ended up in law work, which he said was partially by accident, and partially because being the kind of person who pays close attention to everything seemed better suited to a profession that valued that than to most other options. She told him about growing up in Texas, about her mother's sewing and her father's hardware store that had failed when she was 12, about deciding at 16 that she would learn a skill that was genuinely hers, about the ambition she had always had before Gerald to have her own shop, about the first year the shop had made a real profit and what that had felt like. He listened to everything. He listened in that way he had, without waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, turning it over, asking one careful question at a time that indicated he had heard the thing she said and the thing underneath it. She found herself talking for longer than she had talked to anyone in years. Not because she was nervous, but because it was easy in a way that surprised her. Because there was no management required. No calibration of what was safe to say versus what might be used against her. Just the ordinary, extraordinary experience of being in the presence of a person who was genuinely interested in who you were. At the end of the meal, walking back down the lamplit main street of Dry Creek in the warm July evening, she said, "You are very easy to talk to." He said, "You are very easy to listen to." They stopped at the door to Blackwood Stitchery. The night was clear and the stars over the high desert were enormous and near. She looked up at them for a moment and then looked at him. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "I don't know what I have room for. I have been very focused this past year on rebuilding a life that is actually mine, and I am protective of that." "You should be," he said. "It's yours." "I'm not saying no to anything," she said. "I'm saying I want it to go at my speed." "That sounds entirely reasonable to me," he said. She unlocked the door to the stitchery. She turned back and looked at him. She said, "Same time next Friday." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face, made it younger and warmer and less like a marshal and more like a person, which was, she reflected, exactly the point. "Same time next Friday," he said. What followed was the summer of slow, deliberate courtship in the tradition of two people who have both been somewhere difficult and are approaching happiness with the appropriate caution. They had supper every Friday. They walked on Saturday evenings if the weather permitted. He helped her move a large piece of furniture in the stitchery one afternoon and stayed for coffee and a conversation that lasted 3 hours. She brought him food twice when she noticed, from the erratic light in his office, that he was working very late, and she left it on the porch without knocking because she was not yet ready for the intimacy of showing up unannounced. He noticed the food. He mentioned it the next Friday without making it significant, just said thank you, and the ease of that, the lack of ceremony, made her feel the kind of ease that comes from being with someone who does not need things to be more than they are. The Dale Cutter trial happened in September of 1879 in Albuquerque, and Isaac traveled there to give his testimony. He was gone for a week. The week felt longer to Wilhelmina than she was entirely comfortable with, which was information she filed away and considered. He came back on a Tuesday evening and she was still in the stitchery when she heard his horse on the street and she looked up and saw him through the window, and the feeling that moved through her then was clear and specific and not something she needed more time to name. She came to the door of the stitchery. He tied his horse and walked up the step and looked at her. He looked tired from the road, but there was something lighter in him than when he had left. "Cutter was convicted," he said. "I heard," she said. "Addie's telegraph." He made a sound that was partly a laugh. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside and she made coffee and he sat in the chair near the front window. the one where good light came in for close work. And he told her about the trial and the testimony and the way the prosecutor had handled the case, and she listened. And at some point in the telling, she was standing beside his chair rather than across the room, because she had moved there without consciously deciding to, and she was aware of his shoulder near her hand, and he was aware of it too. He stopped talking. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. There was a moment between them that had the particular suspended quality of a thing that is about to change irrevocably. She said, "I have been thinking about something." He said, "What?" She said, "I have been thinking that I trust you, and that this is not a small thing for me, and that it seems like something that should be acknowledged." He turned in the chair so he was facing her properly. He said, "I have been thinking something similar." She said, "I know your intentions are honorable. You have made that very clear." She paused. "What I am saying is that you can stop being quite so careful about the pace." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, which brought him very close to her in the narrow space between the chair and the sewing table, and he said, "May I?" She said yes. And he brought his hand up to her face with a gentleness that was different from anything she had experienced before, a deliberate, unhurried tenderness that was about her specifically, and he kissed her once, briefly, carefully, the way you do something you have been wanting to do for a long time and do not want to rush. She put her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. They stood like that for a moment in the warm lamplight of the stitchery, with the sound of Dry Creek settling into its evening around them. "That was worth being patient for," she said. He said, "Yes." He was still holding her face. "Very much yes." September turned to October, and what had been careful and tentative became something warmer and more certain. They were seen together regularly now, not just at Friday suppers but at church, at the general store, walking along the edge of town in the early evening where the desert opened up to the west, and the sky went through its extraordinary color sequences as the sun went down. Dry Creek, being a town of 400 observant souls, noticed and discussed and reached its conclusions, and the prevailing conclusion was that the marshal and the seamstress seemed good for each other in the quiet, solid way that was more reliable than spectacular, and that this was a welcome thing. Addie Crane said nothing to either of them except to look pleased in a way that was more eloquent than words. Wilhelmina and Isaac talked about their lives. Not all at once, not in one dramatic revelation, but gradually across the fall evenings and the winter nights, in the way that real intimacy is built, piece by piece and trust by trust. She told him about Gerald, about the 7 years of it, not every detail, not all at once, but enough for him to understand fully what she had been inside and what it had cost her to stay and what it had cost her to survive it. She told him without apology and without the braced quality of someone expecting judgment. He listened with that complete, receiving attention of his, and he said very little while she spoke. When she was finished, he said, "You don't have to keep anything from me, not to protect yourself and not to protect me. I want to know the real shape of your life." She said, "I know, that's why I told you." He told her about Albuquerque, about a woman he had come close to marrying who had decided that a marshal's life was not the life she wanted, which he said was a fair and accurate assessment of the situation that he did not hold against her. He told her about a case he had handled in his first posting that had gone wrong, a fugitive who had been wounded and captured, and then died in custody from injuries that the official report attributed to the capture, but that Isaac had always believed could have been managed differently. He said that case had made him understand that the way you do the work matters as much as the work you do. She understood why he had told her that case specifically. She understood it was connected to what he had done for her, to the larger framework of how he thought about right action. She understood him more fully for knowing it. They were very good together. This was the simple, clear truth. They were good together in the way of two people whose specific shapes fit well, whose silences were comfortable, and whose conversations were alive. He made her laugh more than she had laughed in years. She made him talk more than was usually his habit, not through pressure, but because she was so genuinely interested in what he thought that thinking aloud became easy in her presence. By November, when the first hard cold came and the iron stove in the stitchery became necessary rather than optional, he had begun taking his supper most evenings at her house on Palo Verde Street rather than alone at the hotel, because that was where the evening naturally led them, and because neither of them saw any reason to resist the natural direction of things. Clara, who helped at the stitchery, told the girl at the livery, who told most of the rest of Dry Creek, that the Marshal and Wilhelmina Thatcher were practically keeping house together already, and that anyone who looked at the two of them together could see it was just a matter of time. Clara was not wrong. Isaac asked her, on a clear cold evening in late November, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while the stove clicked and settled, whether she would consider marrying him. He asked it in the same direct, unpretentious way he said most things, without elaborate preface, looking at her steadily across the table. He said that he understood if she was not ready and that he was not trying to put a clock on anything, and that he was asking because he wanted to and because he thought she should know that was where he was. Wilhelmina looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was warm and steady. She said, "I need to ask you something first." He said, "Of course." She said, "If you knew everything about what my marriage was, if you knew all of it, if I told you the worst of it right now, would you still be asking me this question?" He said, "Yes. I would be asking it from the same place regardless of what you told me. I am asking because of who you are, not because of what I don't yet know." She believed him. She believed him the way you believe something that has been tested enough to trust. She told him the worst of it. The things she had never told anyone, not even Addie, not all at once like this. She told him and her voice was steady and her hands were still, and when she was done, she felt lighter than she had felt in years. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He said, "Yes," still asking. She turned her hand over under his and held it. She said, "Then yes, I would like to marry you." They were married in February of 1880 in Dry Creek's church that doubled as a school, on a clear cold morning with the high desert light coming through the windows in sharp white planes across the wooden floor. Addie Crane stood with Wilhelmina in her dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, because she was a woman who made things, who built things with her own hands and her own will, and her wedding dress was no exception. The whole town was there, or very close to it. 400 people had watched this story unfold over the 16 months since Gerald Thatcher's death, and they had their own understanding of it, not the full understanding. The private parts remained private, but enough to know that what stood at the altar of their church was something that had been earned and considered and chosen with open eyes. There was warmth in the room that was not just the warmth of the collected bodies. Isaac Turner stood at the altar in a clean coat and said his vows to Wilhelmina in his quiet voice, clearly and without rush, like a man who has thought carefully about the meaning of every word, and is saying each one as if he means it, because he does. Wilhelmina said her vows back to him and felt, with each word, the closing of something old and the opening of something new, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but in the way of one door quietly shutting and another quietly opening, and the light in the new room being warm. They moved into a house on the west side of town that had more space than either of them had been living in, with a back room that became an extension of Blackwood Stitchery, and a front room that had a proper fireplace and wide windows that caught the morning light. Isaac put up shelves. Wilhelmina put curtains at the windows. They built the shape of a shared life together with the same unhurried deliberateness they had brought to everything. Spring came, and the town of Dry Creek produced its own modest dramas and events around them. A cattle drive that came through and stayed 3 days and left the painted rail considerably richer. A bad thunderstorm in April that took 2 roofs and brought the town together for the repair. A wagon road argument that Isaac had to mediate between 3 neighboring property owners that he resolved with such patient, equitable thoroughness that all three parties left the meeting believing they had won. Wilhelmina watched him work. She watched him do his job with the same steady, principled attention he brought to everything, and she understood more fully with each passing month the kind of man she had married. He was not spectacular. He was not the kind of man who made grand gestures or sought the center of any room. He was the kind of man who showed up every day and did the thing correctly and treated every person he encountered with a base-level respect that was not contingent on status or leverage. She had not known before him how extraordinary that ordinary consistency could be. She told him so one evening, not as a declaration, but just as a true thing said aloud. She said, "I want you to know that you are exactly who you appear to be, and that this is one of the most valuable things I have ever known in a person." He was reading a report. He looked up. He said, "You are the only person who has ever said something like that to me and made it sound like a compliment." She said, "It is the highest compliment I know how to give." He set down the report. He said, "I know." And the way he said it suggested that he understood exactly what that meant, what it implied about where she had come from and what being able to say it had cost her, and that he received it for exactly what it was. In the early autumn of 1880, Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant. She was not entirely surprised, and she was not afraid, which surprised her a little given that she had not known, a year and a half ago, whether she would ever feel safe enough in her own life to want this. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning while the coffee was still brewing, because she was not a person who waited or built up to things when she had something to say. He went very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and then held her against him with a quiet fierceness that said everything. She held him back. She thought about all the roads that had led to this kitchen on this Sunday morning and the improbability of all of it, the specific, intricate chain of events and choices that had deposited her here, safe and loved, and expecting a child with a man who had proved, repeatedly and at personal cost, that he would not use her vulnerability against her but would stand in front of it instead. She thought about the ledger, about Gerald, about the morning she had walked into Isaac's office in July of 1879, ready to be angry, and had found something entirely different waiting for her. She thought about the particular mercy of not knowing, at the time, how much worse it might have been, and the particular grace of it being better instead. Their son was born in the spring of 1881, in May, when the desert bloomed its brief extravagant bloom after a winter of enough rain. He came into the world with a full set of opinions about the process, and made these opinions known at considerable volume, which both Isaac and Wilhelmina took as evidence of good character. They named him Thomas, for Isaac's father who had died when Isaac was young, and Henry as a middle name, for no specific person but because it sounded steady and good beside Thomas. Thomas Turner was a solid, healthy, loud-voiced baby who slept in fits and starts, and regarded the world with dark, serious eyes that were unmistakably his father's, and a general air of determined engagement with everything around him that was unmistakably his mother's. Dry Creek received Thomas Turner with communal warmth. Addie Crane came the day after he arrived and stood in the bedroom doorway looking at Wilhelmina, holding the baby, with an expression on her face that Wilhelmina would remember for the rest of her life. An expression of pure, uncomplicated joy on behalf of another person, which is a rare thing and should always be recognized as such. Isaac Turner proved to be a father with the same qualities he brought to everything else: present, attentive, not dramatic, but fully there. He held his son in the evenings while Wilhelmina ate supper uninterrupted, which she said was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, and he sat up during the difficult nights with an equanimity that she knew cost him in the mornings, but that he never complained about. He also, in the evenings when Thomas was small, would sit in the chair by the fire and talk to the baby in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular: the day's events, the weather, the cases he was working, as if Thomas were a colleague he was briefing. Wilhelmina would sit across the room sewing and listen to this, and feel something enormous and quiet move through her. Life in Dry Creek continued to build itself around them. The railroad extension that had bypassed the town in the 70s finally reached their county in 1882, though not Dry Creek itself, close enough to change the flow of goods and make the general store considerably better stocked. Addie Crane expanded the post office to a full telegraph office and hired 2 assistants. Blackwood Stitchery took on 2 regular employees besides Clara and became the kind of established business that had a waiting list for wedding orders. Isaac was appointed to a broader district in the fall of 1882, which meant more travel but also a salary increase that he told Wilhelmina about by placing the official letter in front of her at the breakfast table and watching her face as she read it. She looked up when she had finished reading. She said, "More territory." He said, "Yes. I wanted to talk to you about it before I gave them an answer." She said, "You want to take it?" He said, "I want to know what you think." She considered. She thought about the stitchery, which was doing well enough now that it could run for short periods without her. She thought about Thomas, who was 18 months old and had recently learned to express strong opinions about where he did and did not wish to be pointed. She thought about Isaac and the work he did and how good he was at it, and how much it suited the deep structure of who he was. She said, "You should take it. The stitchery is solid. Thomas is young enough that travel will seem like adventure to him rather than disruption. And you have been serving a town of 400 for 4 years when I think you were built for a larger mandate." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I'm sure, as long as you come home." He said, "I will always come home." This was not a dramatic vow. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and with conviction, which was exactly what made it worth believing. He took the appointment. The broader territory brought with it a wider range of cases and a more complex web of responsibilities, and he handled all of it with the same methodical fairness that had made him effective in Dry Creek. He was gone sometimes for weeks at a time, and Wilhelmina managed the household, and the stitchery and Thomas with the competent, organized efficiency she had always had, and that had only grown sharper in the years since she had been free to apply it entirely to her own life. When he came home from the longer trips, the homecomings had a particular quality, a warmth and ease and relief that Wilhelmina thought was one of the best things she had discovered in this life, the specific pleasure of someone coming back to you who you were genuinely glad to have. She had not known to miss that quality in her first marriage because she had never had it. She knew now. In the summer of 1883, Wilhelmina told Isaac she was expecting again. Thomas was 2 years old and highly mobile, and recently committed to climbing everything in the house that was climbable, which was most of it. Isaac received this news with the same stillness as the first time and then the same fierce, quiet holding. They were sitting on the porch in the evening when she told him, with the desert sky doing its impossible colors overhead and Thomas asleep inside. The world felt very large and very good. She said, "Are you ready for another?" He said, "I have never felt more ready for anything." She said, "You might be saying that because Thomas is asleep and you've forgotten what he's like when he isn't." He laughed. She loved his laugh. It was not common enough to take for granted, but when it came it was entirely genuine, a full, warm sound that changed the quality of the air in whatever room it was in. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat like that on the porch as the desert stars came out, one and then a dozen, and then the whole impossible multitude of them, and were quiet together in the way of people who have nothing that needs to be said and everything to be grateful for. Their second child arrived in February of 1884, a daughter this time, who came into the world with slightly more composure than Thomas had managed and regarded her parents from the beginning, with an expression of calm, thoughtful assessment that was so specifically Isaac that Wilhelmina laughed the first time she really noticed it. They named her Clara Rose, Clara for the woman who had been with Blackwood Stitchery from its rebuilding, and who had become genuinely important to them both. And Rose because Wilhelmina had always loved roses and had been surprised and pleased to find that the hardy climbing variety, planted against the south wall of their house 3 years ago, had bloomed red and exuberant the previous summer. Clara Rose Turner proved, in the months that followed, to be a child of strong preferences and clear communication and considerable physical ambition. She and Thomas, 18 months apart, formed the kind of sibling alliance that is mostly competitive and entirely devoted, and that produces a household at a constant, energized simmer. Isaac came home from a 3-week circuit in the spring of 1884 to find Clara Rose taking her first assisted steps across the front room floor toward Thomas, who was sitting 3 feet away and holding out a wooden block with the solemn encouragement of a man supervising a very important experiment. Isaac stood in the doorway and watched this for a full minute before either child noticed him. He had the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and is fully aware that this is the right response to have. Wilhelmina came out of the back room and found him still standing there. She stood beside him and watched Thomas and Clara Rose. She said, "Welcome home." He put his arm around her. He said, "Thank you for building all of this." She leaned into him. She said, "We built it." He said, "You built most of it while I was away." She said, "Then it's a good thing I'm good at building things." He held her closer. He said, "Yes, it is." The years continued. Isaac served his extended territory with distinction, and Wilhelmina grew Blackwood Stitchery into the most established dressmaking business in the county, eventually adding a small ready-made line for the practical garments that the ranch families needed and could not spend the time on custom fittings for. She trained 3 girls over the years in the full craft of the work, because she believed in giving what had been given to her, in the chain of useful knowledge passed from one set of hands to another. Thomas grew into a serious, curious boy who was most content when he was taking something apart to understand how it worked, and who showed, by age 8, a mathematical aptitude that his father recognized with quiet satisfaction, and his mother recognized with quiet pride. Clara Rose grew into a child of fierce enthusiasms and strong aesthetic opinions who redesigned the interior of her bedroom at age 6 and declared the result much improved, which everyone agreed was fair. Dale Cutter served his sentence in the territorial prison in Santa Fe and was released in 1885, and he did not return to Dry Creek, which suited everyone in that town, including the marshal, very well. The chapter of Gerald Thatcher's ledger and everything it had contained was fully closed, sealed away in the past where it belonged. One evening in the fall of 1885, sitting in the familiar lamplight of their front room with Isaac reading and Thomas doing his arithmetic at the table, and Clara Rose conducting a complex negotiation with her dolls in the corner, Wilhelmina looked at the scene around her and understood that it was exactly what she had wanted without having had the full language for wanting it, back in the years when wanting was dangerous. Safety. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of a foundation solid enough to face difficulty from. A life that was genuinely hers, made by her own hands and her own choices. A person beside her who had proved, from the very first moment, that he was interested in protecting her agency rather than replacing it. She thought about the girl in the kitchen in 1878, saying there was nothing more to tell, and how that girl had been both right and wrong. Right that certain truths were not safe in that moment. Wrong to believe they could never be safe. Wrong to have closed off the possibility of a different kind of life before it had been offered. She thought about Isaac Turner finding the ledger in the oilcloth at the base of the ravine and making his choice. About the 10 months of careful, private protection. About the afternoon in July when he had told her and the world had rearranged itself around those words. Every report I filed kept your name out of it on purpose. Not a rescue. She had not needed to be rescued. She had been surviving. He had simply declined to add another obstacle to a life that already had more than enough. That was, she thought, the essential thing. The difference between the love she had known before and the love she had now was not that one was bad and one was good. though that was certainly true. The difference was that this love saw her as a person with her own agency and competence and direction, and worked with all of that rather than against it. He had protected her not by taking things into his own hands, but by refusing to be the vehicle by which the machinery of the territory took something from her that she did not deserve to lose. She looked across the room at him. He looked up from his reading and found her looking at him, and held her gaze with those gray eyes that she had learned to read as thoroughly as any text she had ever worked with. She saw in them exactly what was always there: steadiness, warmth, the specific, attentive love of a person who is paying full and genuine attention. She said, "I want you to know something." He lowered the book. He said, "Tell me." She said, "I am happy, actually and completely happy. I want you to know that I know that and that I know it is partly because of you." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I know the feeling exactly." He paused. "It is partly because of you too." Thomas looked up from his arithmetic to say, "What are you talking about?" Wilhelmina said, "Important things. Finish your sums." Thomas made a face and returned to his sums. Clara rose from her corner, said "important things" to her dolls in an administrative tone, and then continued her negotiations. Isaac and Wilhelmina looked at their children, and then at each other, and the quiet between them was full of everything it was supposed to be full of. Spring of 1886 brought news that the territorial marshal's office was consolidating some districts and expanding others, and Isaac was offered a position in Albuquerque that would represent a significant advancement, but also a significant relocation. He came home with the letter and sat with Wilhelmina at the kitchen table, and they talked it through for 2 evenings and a Sunday afternoon. All aspects of it, the opportunity, the disruption, what it would mean for the stitchery, what it would mean for the children's schooling, what it would mean for Addie Crane, who was as close to family as any blood relation. Wilhelmina said on the second evening, "What do you want?" He said, "I want whatever is right for us." She said, "That is not a real answer." He said, "It is a real answer. I mean it entirely. The position is appealing professionally. But I am aware that Dry Creek is where you built your life, and I will not ask you to leave it for my career without your genuine consent." She thought about Dry Creek, about the red earth and the desert sky and the town of 400 that had held her history, the bad and the good both, about the stitchery with its hand-altered sign, about Addie Crane. She thought about who she was now compared to who she had been when she arrived here at 21 with Gerald Thatcher, and the specific hope that a new place might produce a new version of things. The hope had been in the wrong direction then. But she had stayed and survived and rebuilt, and Dry Creek had been the container for all of that. She said, "I think we should go." He looked at her. She said, "I have built what I needed to build here. The stitchery can be sold or the employees can carry it. Thomas is at an age where the schooling in Albuquerque will be better, and I think," she paused, "I think I have been staying partly out of habit, and I am interested in knowing what it would be like to choose a place rather than to simply remain in one." He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I am sure. Ask Addie if she wants to come." He almost smiled. He said, "You want to bring Addie to Albuquerque?" Wilhelmina said, "Addie has run a post office window in a town of 400 for 12 years. She is entirely capable of running a telegraph office in a city. I'm not moving somewhere without my best friend within reasonable distance." Isaac Turner said, "I will ask Addie." He asked Addie. Addie Crane looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Is the territory post paying decent wages in Albuquerque?" He said he believed it was. Addie said, "Tell Mina I'll think about it." She thought about it for 2 weeks, and then came to tell Wilhelmina that she had, in fact, secured a position at the territorial post office in Albuquerque, and would be making the move 2 months after them to get her affairs in order. And she said all of this with the composed, unsentimental practicality that she brought to everything. But her eyes were bright, and she held Wilhelmina's hands tightly when she said it. They left Dry Creek on a clear October morning in 1886, 8 years after Gerald Thatcher had gone over the edge of Cutter's Ravine, and the course of everything had begun to shift. The wagon was loaded with everything that mattered, which turned out to be less than expected and more than enough. Thomas was 6, and Clara Rose was almost 3, and both of them had opinions about the journey that they expressed with characteristic vigor. Wilhelmina stood in the road in front of the house on Paulo Verde Street for a last moment before they pulled away. She looked at the stitchery sign, which the new owner had kept. She looked at the marshal's office where it had all come open in July of a year that felt both close and far. She looked at the church with its double use, and the general store where Addie's window had been the location of so many important conversations. Isaac came and stood beside her. He did not say anything because he understood that this was a moment that did not require words. She looked at it all for 1 full minute. Then she turned and walked back to the wagon and climbed up beside her husband and their daughter and their son, and pointed her face forward. Albuquerque was larger and louder and considerably more demanding of attention than Dry Creek, and they built their life there with the same organized deliberateness they brought to everything. Isaac's work at the expanded territorial office gave him cases of broader scope, and he proved more than equal to them. Wilhelmina sold the Dry Creek stitchery to Clara, who had long since been capable of running it, and opened a new shop in Albuquerque on a street with more foot traffic than all of Dry Creek, and within 2 years it was firmly established. Addie arrived 4 months after them and found a place to live 3 streets over and was immediately indispensable to the territorial post office, as she had been to every institution she had ever graced with her presence. She became a fixture in their household in Albuquerque the same way she had been in Dry Creek, appearing for Sunday dinners and major events, and whenever Wilhelmina needed to talk something through with someone who understood the whole story. Thomas excelled in the better school, as Wilhelmina had predicted. Clara Rose excelled in the stitchery, where she began to appear at age 4 to inspect the work, and where she quickly became known among the employees as the junior critic whose opinion was to be taken seriously. In the spring of 1888, a 3rd child arrived. A boy, born in April with his mother's dark eyes and his father's ears, which Wilhelmina declared was the correct distribution of features. They named him James William, James for the straightforward goodness of the name, and William because Wilhelmina had carried a feminine version of that name through her life and wanted to pass something of it on. James William Turner was a serene and musical baby who slept better than either of his older siblings had managed, and who regarded the world with a benevolent equanimity that made everyone who met him feel briefly calmer. Clara Rose took an immediate and overwhelming proprietary interest in her new brother and spent considerable energy ensuring that he was properly managed. Thomas treated him with the patient elder brother authority of a child who has been waiting to be the senior sibling and now intends to do the job correctly. Isaac Turner, watching his 3 children one Sunday morning as they arranged themselves in the front room in the complicated social geometry of siblings, said to Wilhelmina, "We have built something very good here." She handed him his coffee. She said, "We have been building it since a broken pipe in January of 1879. He accepted the coffee. He said, "I've thought about that morning many times." She said, "Me too." He said, "I almost did not stop. I almost kept walking." She said, "What stopped you?" He said, "You were standing in the street with a bucket and a look on your face that said you would manage perfectly well without help, and that is precisely what made me want to offer it." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very specific memory." He said, "I have kept it carefully." She sat down beside him. The children continued their Sunday social negotiations in the front room. The morning light came through the windows. The city moved around them with its larger, busier noise. She thought about the word carefully. About how much of what Isaac Turner had done from the very beginning had been careful. Not cautious, not withheld, but careful in the sense of full of care. Care for the rightness of things. Care for the dignity of the person in front of him. Care for her specifically before he had any right to it, before she had any knowledge of it, simply because that was the kind of man he was. She said, "I want to tell you something." He set his cup down. He gave her his full attention. She said, "When you told me what you had done that afternoon in July, I was furious at first. And then I was terrified because what you had done was not a transaction. It did not ask anything back. And I was not accustomed to things that did not ask anything back. It was the most frightening thing about you." She paused. "It was also the thing that told me you were different from anything I had experienced before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told you sooner, given you the choice, I know that." She said, "You should have, but I have thought about it many times and I think you were also afraid, not of the case, of me, of what you felt. Of the possibility that if you told me, I would refuse the help and then you would have to watch me face the machinery alone and live with that." He said nothing. His silence confirmed it. She said, "I understand that now. I forgave the choice a long time ago. I just wanted you to know that I understand why you made it, not just that I forgave it." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You understand me very well," she said. "I have been paying close attention for a long time." He said, "I am glad." He picked up her hand. He held it carefully, the way he held most things that mattered to him. "I am glad every single day." She held his hand back. In the front room, Thomas said something to Clara Rose that provoked a sharp response, and James William, disturbed by the noise, expressed his displeasure in clear vocal terms. And Wilhelmina and Isaac both stood up from the kitchen table and went to manage the morning, as parents do, returning to the daily work of the life they had built together. The territorial records in Denver would show, in their dry official language, that the death of Gerald Thatcher in Dry Creek, New Mexico Territory, in October of 1878, had been investigated by Marshal Isaac Turner, and had resulted in the charging and conviction of one Dale Cutter for involuntary manslaughter. The records showed that the case had been handled with thoroughness and procedural correctness. The records showed the name of the widow of the deceased, once, in a single sentence noting that her account of her whereabouts had been confirmed, and that she was not a subject of the investigation. The records did not show a woman rebuilding her life from a foundation of quiet survival. They did not show a man riding past a lit window in the dark of a winter evening, carrying a choice in his chest. They did not show two people finding, in the improbable country between official procedure and genuine humanity, something that turned out to be the most important thing either of them ever found. The records were accurate, in all the ways records are supposed to be accurate. But the story, the real story, lived where it had always lived, in the space between the documented facts, in the careful attention of a man who understood the difference between the letter and the spirit of justice, and in the particular courage of a woman who had learned to survive alone and chose, when the right person came along, to trust again. Thomas Turner would grow up to become an engineer, building bridges across rivers in the expanding territories, and would carry in him his father's precision and his mother's belief that the thing you build should outlast the effort of building it. Clara Rose Turner would, at an age that surprised everyone including herself, take over the Albuquerque stitchery and expand it into 2 locations, and train a dozen women in the craft over her career, which would have surprised no one at all who had watched her at age 4, inspecting the workmanship of her mother's employees with her hands behind her back. James William Turner would become a doctor, which startled everyone and in retrospect surprised no one, because the serene attention he had been applying to the world since infancy turned out to be extraordinarily well suited to the work of understanding what ailed people and what might help. And Isaac and Wilhelmina Turner would grow old together in Albuquerque in the house with the good light, and the garden that Wilhelmina planted and expanded each spring. The roses she planted along the south fence blooming red and extravagant every summer, and they would sit on the porch in the evenings as the desert sky did its colors overhead, and they would be quiet together, or they would talk, and both would be equally good, because that was the nature of what they had. On an evening in the late summer many years on, with the children grown and the house quieter and the porch chairs worn to the shape of long use, Addie Crane came for Sunday supper as she did most Sundays, and she sat across the table from Isaac and Wilhelmina, and she looked at them both with the expression she had worn since 1878, that expression of clear-eyed, unsentimental love, and she said, "You two are still the best thing I ever watched happen." Wilhelmina said, "You facilitated quite a bit of it." Addie said, "I had good material to work with." Isaac said, "You told me to be honest with her." Addie said, "And look how well that worked out." He looked at Wilhelmina. She looked back at him. The evening light was warm and golden, as it had been in the Marshal's office on a July afternoon in 1879, when the world had rearranged itself around a sentence spoken in a quiet voice. As it was now here on this porch, with the roses along the fence and the desert sky wide and clear above them and all the years between then and now full of things built and kept and loved. Every report I filed kept your name out of it on purpose. Not a betrayal, not a trap. Not a dark past or a hidden motive or a forbidden secret, though it had been all those things at once in the suspended moment of first hearing. What it had been, stripped to its essential truth, was a gift. Given without being asked for, given at genuine cost, given because one person had looked at another person and seen them truly, and decided that seeing truly came with responsibility. She had spent a long time learning how to receive that kind of gift, learning that receiving it did not diminish her, did not make her smaller or obligated or managed, that it was possible to be helped without being owned. That love, the right kind, was not a transaction or a cage or a quietly accumulating debt. That it was, at its best, exactly what she was sitting in right now on this porch in the late summer evening. That was, she thought, the whole story. That was all of it. She reached over and put her hand in Isaac's. He looked at her, those gray eyes steady and warm and exactly what they had always been. He held her hand. Addie Crane poured more coffee and pretended not to notice, which she did with great and practiced skill. The desert darkened and the stars came out, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did out here in this big, improbable country where the distances were enormous and the sky was wide enough to hold everything, and where two people who had both, in different ways, been lost had found each other in the middle of it all and built something that lasted.